Is the UK government setting fish cat limits way too high to the point where it's not sustainable? We're going to talk about that on today's episode of Ocean Talk. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. And this is the show where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Today we're going to find out what's happening in the ocean. Now this is an article that happened a couple of weeks ago that came out, and it made a lot of news. It made a lot of press because the UK government has been setting catch limits for fish way too high, to the point where it's past the sustainability of the fish. So here is the breakdown of how catch limits are usually done. They'll take a species, they'll say like cod, right? And they'll say, okay, here is the population models for cod. You get scientists, really smart people who get together, you have policy analysts, you look at people of history of fishing, you get the fishing community involved, and you start to run these models, talk to the fishing community of how many fish they're seeing, what is the catch per unit effort, so how long does it take to catch these fish and how many, and then the quotas that have been in the past. They look at all this data, they put it together, and they say, okay, here's the amount of fish that you can catch so that you can catch the same amount next year, and it'll be sustainable for the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. So what happens is this scientific advice gets provided to the government. The government will go to the fishing industry and they'll negotiate another number. Oftentimes the number should be the same or lower of what the catch limit should be set by the scientific advice. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. So since Brexit and since the UK has been on its own, it's been negotiating with Norway and the rest of the EU to talk about catch limits for 70 different types of species of fish that they can catch. The first year, I think they set the limits 75% higher than what the catch limit should be. And then they set it 57%. And now this year they decided to set it about 55% higher than what the scientific advice is talking about. So they're going beyond the catch limits. This is really dangerous. Here's the problem with the government's in is they get the scientific advice and then they go to the fishing community and they're like, okay, we want to make sure that the fishing industry is profitable. So you have to catch the right amount of fish that will allow you to make a good amount of profit, which fishing industry doesn't make a huge amount of profit for, especially for smaller fisheries, like smaller fishing communities. And so they'll often set it a little high. If you've ever seen the movie End of the Line, which is a great documentary narrated by Ted Danson, they talk about what happens in the Mediterranean tuna fishing industry. And so what happens is the scientific advice gets given and it says, okay, here is, say we'll pick a number, 15,000 tons of fish can be caught at one point in time, so that'll be sustainable for the next year. Then what was happening is the government was taking that information, going to the EU, the rest of the EU, talking to the fishing community, and then they would automatically set, oh, we're going to double that right off the bat. We're going to go 30,000 tons. Okay, let's go 30,000 tons when we go to the fishing communities in the EU and negotiate with the other countries. By the end, they said, okay, we're going to do 60,000 tons. So it's 4 times the amount of what was originally set, and then they would set that as the amount, and that would be the negotiation. So you wondered why the tuna, we didn't wonder why, but we always wondered why the tuna industry or the tuna fishing stocks would go lower and lower and lower each year, because they were fishing 4 times than the scientifically recommended amount should be caught. This is not just unique to the UK. It's not just unique to the Mediterranean and the EU. It happened in Canada. It's why one of the most popular stocks of fisheries, the cod fishery, went belly up in the early 90s. For a long time, in the 70s and 80s, scientists from Fisheries and Oceans Canada were taking stock, and even in NOAA, even in the US, were taking stock of how many fish were there. And so they were doing these surveys and they would account of them. They were looking at abundance, they were looking at biomass, so the size and the number of cod that were being caught, the catch per unit effort, how long it took to catch these fish. And they would go over and over again. Every year they would see that there would be a bit of a decrease happening here. And that's because the catch limits that were recommended were being exceeded every single time. Now, whether that was done that the government was setting or that just the fishing community was trying to get more of, and there's maybe illegal catches, I don't know what that difference is, so please don't quote me on that. But there was something going on where it was allowing, the fish stocks to go dwindle and dwindle and dwindle, into a point where in 1992, Fisheries and Oceans Minister came out and said there's a moratorium on cod. And there's been a moratorium on cod except for a few small fisheries and small test fisheries around in the late 2010s that was happening. But other than that, there was a moratorium on cod, and it changed the face of the fishing industry within Canada, within the east coast of Canada. And it ignited this huge, massive, I just remember watching on TV, there's this massive enragement against the government of fishers, to the government. I remember watching, I don't know if it was like CBC News here in Canada, because I live in Canada, and I remember watching this program where it was showing fishers like storming the office of the fisheries minister and trying to back down the door to get at these fishermen, because they're so angry because it changes their lives. Like, they were passing on the fishing sort of culture generation after generation after generation. Now they were going to have to stop and go and find something new. They weren't trained for anything new. That's messing with somebody's money, that's messing with somebody's food on the table. And it was a very tumultuous time in Canada, and it's been a cautionary tale for fisheries management ever since. And we're still seeing governments sort of set these catch limits higher than what the scientific advice is saying. And this can be very, very, very dangerous for fishing communities. This can be dangerous for the environment, that it changes the entire environment. When I looked at some of the data for my master's degree, we started to see the change after the moratorium on cod and after sort of the depletion of cod and halibut and haddock. We're starting to see these demersal fishes, so these bottom-dwelling demersal fishes, huge fish that actually get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then they eventually disappear from being that dominant fish within the food web. And then you start to see smaller pelagic fish swimming in the water column, where they're just dominant because there's nothing to predate on them. There's no haddock or halibut or cod to predate on them. So there's abundance of them, and that kind of switches what the people are catching in terms of fishing. And so it's kind of what we call, fishing down the food chain. And it's something that can be very detrimental to the environment when you look at it from an entire environment perspective, like a food web perspective. And you just don't want to get into that situation. So fisheries management is there to set these quotas or catch limits. But when you don't listen to them, the scientific advice, you're going to get depletion of fish. And that's what people are worried about now, with the catch limits being set higher than what the scientific advice is supposed to be. And yes, the scientific advice is conservative for a reason. They want to make sure that this fishery is sustainable and all these different species will not just disappear because, all of a sudden they become really tasty or really in style to serve at restaurants or on people's tables all the time. This is something that we have to be concerned about. We have to get government to set better catch limits, listen to the scientific advice, be more conservative, and hopefully by the end of it, we'll see more fish in the sea so that we can fish them and the catch limits could rise. Imagine that. Raising catch limits because the scientific advice says you can. Imagine that. That would be amazing to see one day. I hope we get to see it one day, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you think that these catch limits should be following scientific advice? Do you think that we should be more conservative in this? If you're from the fishing community, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, because I know it messes with your money, it messes with your livelihood. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because there's always two sides to every sort of situation. And this is how conservation is done, is listening to every side. So this is the start of the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more about what I do and what I talk about, you can go to my podcast, How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It's an audio podcast that's on your favorite podcast app. All you have to do is search How to Protect the Ocean or click the link in the description and you can get access to it on your favorite podcast app. So that's it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.